But in the meanwhile, let's get started because we only have an hour of Dr. Shanley's time, and I would like to make a formal introduction right now. Dr. Lea Shanley is the director and president of the International Computer Science Institute, ICSI, in Berkeley, California. Previously, she served as a senior fellow at the Nelson Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I first met her when she was a White House Presidential Innovation Fellow under the Obama administration. She was a founding co-executive director of the NSF South Big Data Innovation Hub, the founding director of the Wilson Center's Commons Lab in Washington, D.C., a AAAS Congressional Science Fellow and primary science advisor to former Senator Bill Nelson of Florida, and a postdoc with the NASA Mapping Science Committee. Dr. Shanley also served as the co-founder of the Federal Community of Practice on Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science, FedCCS, which resulted in citizenscience.gov and many other important outcomes. Her research is focused on bringing spatial technologies, computer-supported cooperative work, and social computing to bear on scientific and societal challenges, as well as addressing issues in science and technology policy and research data policy, which is why we are so happy to have her here today sharing with us her thoughts on our policy-focused GIS Symposium. So Lea, I'll turn it over to you, and I will be here ready to help advance these slides.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Diana, for the kind introduction. I'm going to turn off my camera while I'm delivering the presentation, and then we'll turn it back on for the discussion. I encourage folks to put their comments and questions in the chat box. Love to see active conversation there. So if we're to address the critical challenges facing our country and the world, we'll need not only more data, but also better data. We'll need to identify and analyze the problems we face with this data, like the pandemic and global climate change, and develop equitable strategies and solutions to these challenges, and to evaluate our impacts. But as scientists, we often think that if we collect the data, conduct the research, and publish our results in prestigious journals, that we've done our part. That policymakers and decision makers will go to the library, read our journal articles, understand what they've read, and take appropriate action. Sadly, that's not how it works. Science is but one factor in policy decision-making. GI science sits in a unique position. To quote Alan Irwin, it's at a location at the point where public participation and knowledge production, or societal context and epistemology, meet, even if at the intersection that may take different forms. We have an opportunity here to bring members of the public and members of the GI science community with policymakers to consider the possibilities for more active scientific citizenship and to link these issues into public policy. Geospatial science and technology can help to provide the evidence base for which to inform a wide range of management and public policy decisions, while at the same time fostering partnerships with government. Next. So I'm going to briefly touch on GI science for policy, policy for GI science, opportunities we might have going forward in the future, and then how do you work with your policymaker. Next. Next. So policy challenges facing our nation today need intelligent solutions that are backed by data, research, and evidence. The GIS programs in the federal government have been stepping forward to meet these challenges in the last decade. So for example, across America in both urban and rural communities, families don't have access to grocery stores, making it hard for them to get affordable and nutritious food. The Food Desert Locator, a new interactive tool launched by USDA, allows policymakers and the public to locate food deserts. The locator identifies about 10% of approximately 65,000 census tracts as having food deserts. That's about 13.5 million people who are impacted. Policymakers, urban planners, and local community organizations can use this locator to help target where policies and interventions are needed. HUD, on the other hand, with this new administration, has an opportunity to use GIS to assist its affordable housing and zoning initiatives, and its mission to create strong, sustainable, and inclusive communities. For example, the Biden administration could direct HUD to make zoning reform requirements a requirement of federal grant programs. The zoning policy could then be carried out by local policymakers. HUD is using their GIS technology through the Opportunity Project to identify vacant lots for affordable housing development using a GIS site suitability analysis. This then in turn could be used for local policy decisions. Next. At the congressional level, we often think of, the members of Congress, but there's a lot of other folks in each personal office of a member of Congress, including communications staff, legislative policy staff, correspondents that, answer constituent letters, and the sysadmin. Over the past decade, personal offices of members of Congress have begun to employ GIS both for their operational and policy needs. They're using GIS to map constituent correspondences and attitudes towards proposed legislation, to analyze the policy issues, to communicate policy proposals and impacts during the consideration of legislation, and to communicate with the public and the media. GIS can help members of Congress to better serve their constituents by mapping and visualizing the issues at the local level and at the state level and giving them the information they need to weigh in on the legislation. So, for example, Senator Risha's office from Idaho has been a leader in this regard. His office, for example, has used Esri's ArcGIS product software to develop a set of maps that helped pass legislation in 2015 that designates the Boulder White Clouds area in central Idaho as a wilderness preserve. When I worked in the Senate in Bill Nelson's office, I worked with the Library of Congress GIS staff to gather 130 data sets of Florida, so hitting up my NISGIC colleagues to get access to that data so that our office would be prepared in case there was an oil spill in the Gulf, and unfortunately that did come to pass. Next. In addition to how GIS science can help public policy, we can also think about the needs of policy to support GI science and GIS implementation. Next. But the road to the Geospatial Data Act, as Tony Spicci could tell you, was a long one. A16, I think it originated in the early 50s and was revised in the 60s. But in the 90s, things began to pick up. In 1990, A16 was revised to establish the Federal Geographic Data Committee, and as well as the National Spatial Data Infrastructure. The states also came together, importantly, to form the National States Geographic Information Council, with a need to share lessons learned, best practices, and develop standards. And then in the early 2000s, Congress began to take notice. Next slide. In the mid-2000s, the states were the innovators, not necessarily the federal government. So NISGIC drove an agenda called the 50 States Initiative to establish statewide GIS councils in every state, and importantly, statewide geographic information officers that were positioned in state government. This gave the geospatial community a seat at the table and began to increase the use of GIS and GI science in management and policy decision-making at the state level. NISGIC also developed the Geospatial Report Card, which was modeled after the Transportation Report Card, to track each state's progress related to the core NSDI framework layers. Concurrently, the FGDC developed the Federal Geospatial Service Model, which laid out a governance model for geospatial technology across the federal government. But federal progress was slower than the state geospatial community would have liked. They wanted to have input on this. So they established the Coalition of Geospatial Organizations to have a stronger voice in federal decision-making. Next slide. So in 2009, when I was a fellow in Senator Nelson's office, I found that a lot of the congressional staff and members of Congress really weren't aware of geospatial technology or GI science. And there were some proposals that were put forward by folks like Jack Dangerman for what would the National Spatial Data Infrastructure 2.0 look like. But I wasn't seeing much traction from the position of the office I was in. And I began to organize with my colleagues who were other AAAS fellows in other offices, a series of congressional briefings and meetings. So bringing in FGDC folks, bringing in some of my NISGIC colleagues to meet with congressional offices. NISGIC was doing the same at this time. I then found that the Congressional Research Service, which provides technical and scientific expertise to congressional staff, was an ideal opportunity to get the word out. And so as a representative from my office, I requested that Pete Folger, well, specifically requested the Congressional Research Service, and analyst Pete Folger was the one to implement it, assemble some reports on the role of geospatial technology in the federal government and the importance of the national spatial data infrastructure. I also requested on behalf of my office that those reports be public so that all congressional offices could get access to them. Walked over this across the street to the Library of Congress, started meeting with the Congressional Research Service and Library of Congress GIS staff to help build up the GIS data collections that they had on hand. And then I got word from my colleagues on the House side that they were having a hearing and on the National Spatial Data Infrastructure, and I immediately alerted my NSGIC colleagues that MAPS was going forward with this and ensured that NSGIC and others were invited. Next slide. In 2010, things really began to accelerate. My colleague Tim Petty in Senator Risch's office built on that momentum that we started prior to 2010 and began to organize a formal Senate GIS user group. Ostensibly, they were focused more on the operational needs of the offices using GIS, but it also allowed them to understand the technology and its potential for policy. Serendipitously, that same year, I ran into both Tim Petty and my colleague Chris Diller from NSGIC at the 2010 Esri Fed GIS conference and introduced them in the hallway after the session. As fate would have it, these two innovators formed a close collaboration that helped to drive the Geospatial Data Act forward. Senators Hash and Senators Risch sent a letter to the A16 agencies requesting information on the federal investments that they had made in geospatial data, but only 3 responded with information and 18 of them had none. So in 2015, the heat was turned up on federal agencies. COGO issued a geospatial report card, and the Government Accountability Office produced a somewhat critical report of the duplicative efforts of federal agencies with regards to GIS. In 2016, 2 competing geospatial bills were introduced in both the House and Senate by Senator Risch and his co-signatories in the Senate. And over time, the bill became what we'd call a Christmas tree. It ballooned to more than 200 pages, and it wasn't really moving. So Tim Petty and his colleagues, using the House bill, reduced the number of pages in that legislation to 40 pages, so getting down to basics. They provided no authorization of funding, which meant that they'd have a better chance of gaining bipartisan support. Next slide. In 2018, the GDA was finally passed as part of the FAA Reauthorization Act. It codifies the FGDC and the National Geospatial Data Committee, which is a government FACA that provides advice to the government. It adds OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, as a co-chair, which is important. We like to say that OMB is the hammer. You can either threaten the hammer or you can use the hammer. And it importantly requires the development of metrics and evaluation system to support good government. I would argue that you also need OSTP at the table, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, if you really want to begin to think about the scientific enterprise with regards to federal geospatial. Next slide. So just to show you, my colleague Chris Diller from NSGIC, one of the movers and shakers around the GDA before 2010, and then after the 10 years it took to get this legislation passed, he's got a nice gray beard. Next slide. So as you can see, getting legislation passed can be a long process. When I was a fellow, another example is around National Civil Earth Observations. Many of you may be aware of the U.S. Group on Earth Observations, or USGEO, which is intended to help coordinate federal observations, research, and activities in the U.S. federal government, and deal with data management, interoperability, and also coordinate internationally with space agencies around the world. At that point in 2009, there were 3 core Earth observation agencies: NASA, NOAA, and USGS. Next slide. But each of those agencies developed their mission plans of what satellites were going to go up for observations based on their own needs. And there was a growing community consensus that there was need for a national strategy. In 2009, as you recall, that was also the Obama administration's effort to pass climate legislation. So as a AAAS fellow in Nelson's office, I was tasked with coming up with climate legislation that the senator could introduce. But he didn't give me explicit instructions on what he wanted. He just said he'd like some climate legislation. So I did what any GI scientist would do, and I began to do some research. Ultimately, I interviewed more than 60 people across the federal government and in the science communities on what was needed. And across the board, the scientists and agency staff said that we needed better coordination of our Earth observation infrastructure, that we needed a national strategy and plan. So based on that research, I drafted a standalone bill requiring that the Office of Science and Technology Policy formulate a national strategic Earth observation plan. Taking my cue from NSGIC, I also included an emphasis on the need to get input from state, local, and tribal governments, the private sector, and the public in the plan's development. But my fellowship came to an end in December 2009 before we were able to introduce the bill. So I handed it off, the draft legislation, to Ann Sulkowski on the Senate Science Subcommittee. Because there was a Senator Coburn who often said no to new legislation, the bill was incorporated into the NASA Authorization Act because it would be harder to stop. So Ann was able to get it into the NASA Reauth, and my colleague Peter Callahan, who was then at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, Lawrence Friedel, who was at NASA, and many others mobilized 300 federal staff as a result of this legislation to publish the first National Civil Earth Observation Strategy in 2014. Next slide. And the Trump administration then issued a follow-up to that plan in 2019, and this guides coordination of billions of dollars in investments in Earth observation. Next slide. Next slide. So what do we do going forward? Well, we're now, because of the GDA, into implementation of the National Spatial Data Infrastructure's strategic goals. They've finished phase 1 reporting and are now in progress on phase 2. Next slide. The National Civil Earth Observation Strategy and Plan is finally seeking broader public input. Because of the way government is structured and how they're able or not able to accept public input, they have to do so in a formal way so as not to be subject to lobbying. They're doing 4 virtual public meetings. I highly encourage you to register and participate. They've also got a series of questions that they're asking for public input on to provide through June 30th. Next slide. So the President Biden has proposed the 2022 budget for the U.S. government that would boost federal spending about 9% or $13.5 billion. The plan puts an unprecedented emphasis on translating scientific discoveries into practical tools for fighting climate change, disease, bolstering the economy, and tackling other issues. Congress will likely reject or revise parts of this proposal, but it still could lead to numerous new funding entities and alter how government invests in academic research, particularly through the NSF. Next slide. In its budget request to Congress, the administration seeks NSF's discretionary budget to increase by 20%, or about $10.2 billion. And I was excited to see that social and behavioral economic sciences is getting a bump up, as well as some of the other areas. But of course, we're all eyes or attention on the America Frontiers Act. Next slide. The budget request includes possible plus-ups for climate research, AI research, which has got some great opportunities with geospatial and Earth observation, and big ideas. Next slide. But perhaps the biggest question is what will happen with the proposal to create a new NSF directorate, technology directorate, and that's going to be voted on today. There are competing bills in the House and the Senate, which if passed will need to be reconciled. The Senate's version places a big emphasis on security, the economy, immigration, and competition with China, whereas the House bill is focused on an NSF reauthorization, straight and simple. The result of this legislation, if passed, may have major negative as well as positive consequences to the scientific community. So we really need to be paying attention to this. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So policy is a multifaceted process for which science is but one factor. When we start our research projects, we really need to consider, do we want to have a policy impact or social impact? And if so, how? And what are the strategies to get there beyond traditional, research process? So thinking out ahead of what is your theory of change? How will that change happen? Do you need to go to Washington to do briefings, etc.? How might your research influence or change policy in practice, or and what are those pathways to get there? What are the outcomes? Not just the publications and the presentations, but what are the actual outcomes? Next slide. So often scientists think that if only a policymaker understood the science or had the same data, if only the policymaker understood all the nuance, then the policymaker surely would agree with the scientist and surely would do as the scientist recommends. But that's not the case. Politics and jurisdiction matter. In Washington, D.C., they often reference the 3 Ps. That's policy, politics, and procedure. My colleagues and I would also add people. It's all about building trusted relationships. Precedent. Has there been similar prior legislation? Has a federal agency done this before? Has the policymaker's office supported this issue in the past? And of course, public relations. What are the optics? Perception is reality, as they say in DC. How will the media cover this issue? Next slide. Science and tech policy, however, is very unpredictable and complex. There are many actors, complex process, unwritten social norms. There's a low signal to noise, lots of competition for time and attention of the policymaker. They have limited bandwidth. They're smart people, sometimes with masters and PhDs. There's one in there with computational physical chemistry. We've got a physicist in Congress. The staff, particularly committee staff, are often highly educated PhD folks, but they have no time to learn the jargon of every discipline, of every scientist who marches through the office. So be prepared to fail or be ignored, but have patience. This process can take a long time, years, but it can pay off. Next slide. So here's just an example of the development of the federal budget process. And if you want to have input into it, see what a kind of complex process this can be. Those congressional staffers, they know this process like the back of their hand. So they have some unique expertise that we need to value. Next slide. So to compare and contrast the research community and policymakers, the research community, of course, places emphasis on the scientific process and on merit review, whereas policymakers, they're interested in local impact, good publicity. Research community always wants more funding for their research, and policymakers, want to provide good government, provide close oversight of federal government and its spending. Research community is often kind of looking out to the long-term view, whereas policymakers, well, they're interested in getting reelected. Next slide. So a few tips when you're going in to meet with a congressional office or even your state legislature. Be well-timed. Consider the timing of the policy you're advocating for. Is there a policy window? Are things coalescing so that the timing is just right? Or are you going to be coming up against a lot of headwinds? When you have that appointment, be on time and keep it short. Members of Congress, you may have minutes with them. Personal staff, you might be lucky to get 10 or 15 minutes. Committee staff, on the other hand, that do deeper dives, bigger legislation, you might be able to get an hour of their time. Please, please, please respect the scheduler for the office. They're the gatekeeper to that policymaker. And the next year, they may be the legislative aide you meet with, and the year after that, be the member of Congress's chief of staff. Respect the expertise of the legislative staffer. The aide knows the policy member's interests and positions on the issue. They understand the federal budget cycle. They understand the congressional or agency procedure. They know the stakeholders and the political landscape. Ask what else the staffer is working on. Perhaps you can provide some technical assistance that will lead to future collaborations with that office. And don't embarrass or burn bridges. Don't ask for new parking lots or airplane rides. Don't show displeasure. Don't be dismissive of the younger staff. Again, these folks will work their way up the ladder pretty quickly and will be your ally if you are genuine and, show up on time and provide good information. Congressional offices are like competing labs. They all want to be the first to pass groundbreaking legislation. If an office tells you to keep a close hold, don't CC others, don't post it to your social media accounts, you'll lose their trust and won't be consulted again. But do tell offices what other congressional offices you may be meeting with. They can reach out to these offices if they decide to support your request. Also be mindful of protocol. Which committees have the right jurisdiction? Make sure you go to them first before you go to other offices. Next slide. I can't stress enough, plain language, less technical jargon. Avoid using technical jargon. I don't mean dumb it down, but you don't need to share all the nuance of your research. Be concise, be concrete, and easy to understand. Next slide. Before the meeting, do your homework in advance. Learn about the decision maker's priorities. What have they supported or not supported in the past? What are the relevant existing statutes, regulations, policies, or budgets? Which agencies have jurisdiction over your topic? Which congressional committees have jurisdiction? Who are the other stakeholders and what are their positions? Don't bring big binders, bring a one-page memo. The big binders, the journal articles, they end up in stacks of unread material on the staffer's desk or worse, in a waste bin. Instead, write up a short bulleted memo, print out your PowerPoint to give it out as a handout, but you can provide links to more detailed information reports if they express interest. Practice your pitch in advance. Perhaps ask a colleague to role play with you as a policymaker and get their feedback. In fact, some of the professional societies like AGU have a congressional visits day where they do what I'd call murder sessions ahead of time, so they practice. During the meeting, focus on building that relationship and trust on a personal level. Increase the mutual understanding and it'll keep you on the policymaker's radar screen. Make your information relevant to that policymaker. Focus on connecting with his or her interests. Understand the context. Why is your work relevant not only to science, but to society writ large, and specifically to the policymaker and his district? Who are their constituents? On which committees do they serve? What is their legislative jurisdiction? What are their position statements and proposed legislation? And how does what you're proposing fit in with that? Provide one or two concrete examples or stories about why the issue is relevant. And this is where GI science and GIS can be really strong because we can visualize it. Demonstrate a tangible impact of your work. And then make your ask clear and specific. What actions do you want the office to take? Do you want support for legislation? Support for appropriations? Leave the spin behind. Don't tell the staffer some BS. They are really good at detecting it. And if you misrepresent yourself or your work, staff will find out. And coordinate with others who also might be visiting the Hill, large or small. Have repeated interactions with the policymakers. Next slide. So I've provided a few resources here. There are a lot of science and technology policy fellowships in DC and now beginning to be set up around the country in different states. Myself, I did 2, the Presidential Innovation Fellows, which is for senior level technologists of all ages to do a tour of duty in the federal government, often at a high level, working with the White House or an agency administrator. And the AAAS Fellowship, which is for PhD scientists and engineers. And that also includes a congressional opportunity. I had in 2009 and 10 tried to persuade AAG and UCGIS to sponsor a fellow, a AAAS fellow. Unfortunately, there wasn't complete buy-in, but the other scientific organizations like AGU and the Geosciences do support fellows, and as a result, after 40 years of this program, they have a lot of the committees in Congress are staffed by their former fellows, PhD scientists in their fields. So I think our field could greatly benefit by supporting one of these fellowship programs. Next slide. I've also provided some resources on how not to be a scientist, basically talking with policymakers and getting some traction. And lastly, doing good takes more than good intentions. As a GIS science community, we need to be proactive. We need to actively work to inform, although perhaps not lobby, policymakers. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for that, Lea. Thank you very much. Folks, we've got time right now for some Q&A. Please feel free to put anything into the chat space. The whole group could see it, and we'll be able to have a question about that.
Or comments, or share their own experiences.
Sure, right. Lea, I'd like to start off the conversation right now with some of the legacy from some of your earlier work dealing with citizen science and crowdsourcing work. How have you seen the integration of those sources of data into federal agencies change over time? What has evolved in those ways?
So there are some agencies that have been using crowdsourcing in citizen science or supporting it for a long time, like the National Science Foundation and the U.S. Geological Survey. But in the U.S. Geological Survey, for example, they were often considered pilot projects because there was a lot. I mean, the first thing you'll get when you either talk to a federal agency staffer back in 2010, 2011, or even a scientist is, what about the data quality, right? So a lot of concerns about the data quality. Then they'd ask, what about privacy? And what about cybersecurity? And what about? And they'd have a long list. And so I was funded by the Sloan Foundation for the Commons Lab to look at the role of crowdsourcing in citizen science, particularly in disaster response. As folks may remember, in 2010, there was the Haitian earthquake, and grassroots groups around the globe emerged to curate social media and to develop maps so that to help the responders. There were a lot of challenges with that. It was a Wild West. And so while FEMA and other response agencies, the American Red Cross and International Red Cross were interested, they were also concerned about the risks. So how could we appropriately use crowdsourced information and not divert critical resources? How could we use it and not put our responders at risk? And so began to hold a series of roundtables, bringing together these volunteer groups with the GI science and academic research community and with the government agencies to look at some of these different issues of data quality, to look at how do you mobilize volunteers, how do you sustain their interest, figure out what the research agenda was, and how do we create durable workflows. And that group began to build momentum. So we went from a small number of people, and then we doubled in size, and then we doubled in size. And about 2 years in, we began to recognize that the issues that the disaster response community was facing with crowdsourced data, they were also facing these same kinds of challenges in other agencies. So, for example, in the U.S. EPA or the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration. So myself and about 8 colleagues got together and put together a kind of a 101 workshop for federal agency staff on crowdsourcing and citizen science. And that we ended up having, I think, 200 people total between in the room and online. So the interest was overwhelming, and this was 2013. And that galvanized us as a community to form a formal community of practice, to share lessons learned, best practices, because before that there might be one person in NASA and another person at the FCC doing these approaches, and they didn't know each other existed. They didn't know that maybe someone else down the hall was interested in it too, and this allowed them to connect. And also out of that workshop, we identified the need for an Office of Management and Budget policy memo to provide kind of that top level support and encouragement. Because if I was a program manager in a federal agency and I said I wanted to do a citizen science project, I'd get no from the federal counsel, or I'd get no from the top level manager. I actually had a federal counsel at NASA tell me, you can't do it unless it's explicitly authorized. So then we said, okay, well, we need legislation to explicitly authorize it. Not really. I mean, in theory, it was already authorized, but this allowed us to clarify that authorization. So we formed a federal community of practice, began to share, meet every month, and I ended up doing several briefings with the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and finally got traction in the technology division. They then incorporated some of our recommendations into the National Open Government Plan, that then called on our proposal for a toolkit, like how do you get started? How do you design a project? How do you evaluate it, etc.? A catalog, and just like the states, so kind of taking the cue from the states, have a catalog of data. Do we have a catalog of projects? Can we estimate how much money we're putting into citizen science and crowdsourcing? We can't at this point. The catalog is beginning to get us there. I then serendipitously met a Hill staffer in Senator Kuhn's office at a happy hour. She also was a AAAS fellow, and we hit it off. I was just enthusing about citizen science. I wasn't, necessarily planning to have them call us in, but they called us in to give a briefing. And then a month or two later, they called back and said they're going to write legislation, and who do they need to be talking to? And off we were to the races. During that period, I transitioned to become a presidential innovation fellow. So I was working day to day with the White House, and using that umbrella as a convener, we were really able to mobilize 125 staff to build the toolkit, to develop the catalog, and to roll it out at a big event. The last 4 years, however, John Holdren, the president's science advisor at the time, Obama's advisor, said shortly after that point, he went to a big climate summit in Tokyo, and he said all anybody could ask him about was the citizen science memo he just issued. So that was exciting, but the last 4 years has been more challenging. So I'm really excited. They're now this is the second time they've reported to Congress on their progress. So the legislation, just like the Geospatial Data Act, requires regular reporting, but they're trying to figure out now how can they be more impactful in terms of the metrics that are developed to track their progress and the evaluation approach. So I think that's where we have next. And then the other areas, we've got, emerging low-cost sensors that are being developed. Mm-hmm. So how do we use those? Some of those biofoul fairly quickly. How do we evaluate their effectiveness? If they don't quite meet agency standards, what does that mean? So there are a lot of open research challenges for the geospatial community to look at now.
Right. Speaking of opportunities, what are your thoughts on what anyone in the geospatial community could be doing conversation-wise or connections-wise with the possibility of the infrastructure bill development?
Yeah, so, there's two levels to that. So I think that the National States Geographic Information Council has done a phenomenal job, and COGO has done a phenomenal job pushing forward an action agenda that has really moved the government forward in geospatial. But it's been focused, in my mind, largely on the implementation side, not as much thinking perhaps on the research side. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for us to talk about what policies and perhaps statutes, what budget authorizations need to go forward to support GI science research. particularly, say, in the context of this NSF legislation that might be going through. OMB is at the table. What we don't have is necessarily required engagement of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And that is the real driver. That office is the driver of the research agendas. So in the last year of the Obama administration, I could have told you each and every OSTP staffer that was responsible for each and every NSF priority area for funding. Right? They have a big, they don't often like to admit it, but they do have a big influence on what gets prioritized. So making sure to meet with those staffers in the various offices, so anything from water to climate to the economy, we should be mobilizing in a coordinated fashion to educate these staffers on what GI science can do and what our community's research agenda is. Mm-hmm. So on that front, I don't know how much UCGIS has engaged with the Computing Community Consortium of the Computing Research Association, which is directly funded by the National Science Foundation. The CCC is a visioning organization. They bring together the research community with some federal agency staff to develop community-driven research agendas for emerging areas of research. We could really use one for geospatial science, and then NSF and the other agencies use that agenda to help inform their decisions for making investments. But it doesn't happen just because you make the agenda. Ann Drobness, the executive director of the CCC, her colleagues hold strategic briefings with members of Congress, the agencies, and the White House, and also invite the community, the research community, to come and do the same. Right now, with the change of administrations, they've issued a series of publications they've called the Quadrennial Papers. So they've invited, you can ask if they're willing to consider it, but 2 or 5 authors to put together what they see to be a research agenda in a specific, say, subdiscipline of the field. And so, for example, myself and Lucy Fortson and Kevin Crowston and Pietro Michelucci put together a paper on citizen science, crowdsourcing, and AI, mm-hmm. and what the research agenda is.
So, for example, if there were something like a paper of that nature on GeoAI or something else that was particularly germane to infrastructure conversations, mm-hmm. if that type of thing, it sounds like some of the most important outcomes come from both serendipitous conversations, but also having something, as you've described, something solid but brief, without the jargon and ready to go.
Yeah, so I think, in talking with Chris Diller and other NISGIC colleagues, they've had a lot of impact, not just going to Washington, but also visiting the congressional offices in their states, in their regions. So that's one place you could go as well. You don't need to mm-hmm. have a budget to travel necessarily. But living in Washington or being in Washington does provide that opportunity for serendipitous or perhaps strategic, in that, you can have meetings, but also there's often a lot of big galas and events and, talks and things at the think tanks. And you can, kind of strategically identify the policymaker or agency person you want to talk to who's going to be presenting, and take the opportunity to talk to them, after they give their talk or after, during coffee, when they don't have all the handlers around them. Mm-hmm. And you can begin to build a little bit of a relationship. Then eventually you get invited to come into the office and share what you're doing. But I do think it's important, to demonstrate that you've got the community behind you, that wasn't just initially your personal ask, but that the larger research community has laid out this vision.
Good. I'm wondering about your thoughts. David Telek wrote a question here about a specific role for UCGIS that leverages our strengths while recognizing the burdens of our limitations, which are that we are a very tiny organization. So everything we do needs to be strategic in how it can be scaled for benefit with a relatively low cost to begin with, time and capacity wise. But I was wondering, when you gave some great ideas that seem like they would be targeted really well to to junior faculty, perhaps to postdocs. I'm wondering if you were in charge of a university department that granted a geospatial PhD program, and you wanted to provide your graduate students an opportunity to become more savvy in the policy area, and make some connections with research. What kind of advice might you give to the chair of a geography department who wanted to do some work and make some progress?
So I actually have met with a lot of students, postdocs, and early career faculty one-on-one versus necessarily through a chair to advise them on this. So I had listed a series of fellowships that they could consider. The AAAS, for example, had early career postdocs to early career faculty all the way up to retired emeritus professors joining. So you don't have to be a specific age group. At any point in your career, you could become a AAAS fellow. I'd have to say it was one of the best and most challenging years of my life, but the fact you're surrounded by a community of like-minded scientists from all over the country in different aspects, different kinds of science, but all focused on climate change or on water or food security. So you could look at things from different perspectives. Very active. They have affinity groups and a lot of professional development. So if you get more than just, learning about the policy process, you also get connected to a network of nerds around the country that you could call, any of them, if you want advice. They're very active. There are other fellowships, the Mirzayan Fellowship, the Sea Grant, all afford some opportunity to work in Washington. Now there's a movement, Deborah Stein and colleagues, to get similar kinds of fellowships set up at the state government level. So California, New Jersey, for example, have those. So you could take a sabbatical to do this, or you could take a year off in between your PhD and your postdoc. I think there's also, I've seen some coursework or curriculum development around GIS and public policy. For example, the University of Chicago has a program in this. So that would be definitely worth considering. I think there's some real opportunities now with this data science institutes popping up around the country at different universities. So for example, at Berkeley, they've just established the Computing, Data Science, and Society division, right, with a big emphasis on the social good or social impact of this research. GIS, geospatial science, needs to be at that table, right? I haven't seen a lot of that yet. At the University of Wisconsin, they're trying to figure out how those those collaborations are going to work. The other place where I think as a board chair is to go to NSF, because SIZE, the computing division, really has only included in data science, mathematics, statistics, and computer science. It didn't hear geospatial in that. Right. And that was very intentional. So I don't know if it's because, the geospatial folks are handled in a different division or what, but there needs to be better coordination or better integration, I think, of geospatial data science with these other data science initiatives through NSF.
Yeah, certainly the connections between geospatial and computer science, period, have faltered it over time with some. It just hasn't been the connection they've pursued, and it's been recognized increasingly that it's created some shortcomings for some people graduating with a degree in GIS to not have, or geography, to not have some of the both just not the technical training, but the inclination and the proclivity to be connecting more with computer science colleagues.
I think it will be, policy aside, absolutely critical that new graduates coming out of geospatial programs have some data science background. Going to the GeoBiz conference last year with a lot of the CEOs of the satellite companies and some of the analytics companies, they're all looking for people with data science skills. Mm-hmm. And so that I think that traditional GIS program curriculum needs to be updated at some institutions.
Right.
I also have seen some universities do a great job in putting together kind of industry and government advisory committees that help them identify the skill sets that mm-hmm. are needed, because not everyone can go off to become a faculty member. Some are going to get jobs in the real world. So that's another opportunity to identify what skills that we should be training folks in.
Right. Right. Debs Ghosh made a comment here about the frequency with which geospatial data science gets folded under data science, and that happens a lot when you look at the curriculum, when you see the faculty that are there. And you can see frequently that in coursework, they may work with latitude and longitude data sets or census data, but you don't often have a real either geography or GIS faculty that might be on that program committee or helping to contribute to that curriculum.
Yeah, I was surprised when some of the computer scientists at University of Wisconsin asked me, where can they get satellite data? I said, well, if you walk across the street to the Environment Remote Sensing Center. But that's right, the data scientists are looking at the data. They don't have the science, the physics, the geodesy that a geographer or GIS specialist would have, right? Mm-hmm. So bringing the two together can sometimes be challenging. I tried to bring together data scientists with hydrologists, and the hydrologists, they've got their physical understanding and the models, and the data scientists speak a different language. So we need to do some translation there as well.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions from the audience? Comments, questions, thoughts for Lea? I think that strategically UCGIS is very interested in ways that as an organization we can try to rejuvenate some of the work that we used to do more with external relations and policy, ways that we can be strategic in that. I know that you and I and others on the executive committee have just begun to articulate some of the things that we could be doing. We'll have to see going forward. I know our new incoming executive director is particularly interested in this area of activity too. So,
mm-hmm. Wonderful.
I had one other final question. Let's see. Des has a comment. Other than location and related methods, what can we bring to the table of policy making? Feels like we need new words and phrases. The word spatial is frequently, increasingly used. Location has been co-opted in a lot of ways by business, but it's a very useful and meaningful one for a lot of the work that we do. And then geospatial sometimes has, if you look back at how it's been used, it originally was used a little more in the geo in community than elsewhere, but now these days we tend to use geospatial just much more frequently. But I don't know if there are any other new words or phrases that you might suggest that we'd be savvy about using in our conversations.
So a colleague of mine, Steve Felgus, who is a PhD chemist who sits on the Natural Resources Committee on the House, I had invited him to give a talk to the Mapping Sciences Committee at the academies, and he highlighted this. He says, you guys say this, you guys say parcels. He says, we have no idea what parcels means. Why don't you say parcels of land? He says, then we'd understand it. So sometimes it's pretty simple, but he said location is something that all policymakers really care about, right? They care about their district. What we do should be really resonating with policymakers, and yet it is our jargon that inhibits us, I think, from making that leap. We often say, speak as if your mother or dad could understand what you do.
So it's not, for these important conversations, it's not so much getting hung up about using a word that you might not use in a journal article as much, but make sure that it's the right one you need for that conversation with that, for that particular purpose.
Be concrete and tell a story.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent.
So I see one question before we get off about
Yeah.
my suggestion that UCGIS maybe join forces with AAG or other organizations to sponsor a AAAS fellow every year, so that over time you will have a cohort of GI savvy people who are, staffers in congressional offices, in key committees, and those folks often, after they do several years and end up as, deputy assistant secretary at an agency. So it would be well worth, I think, considering.
All right. Yeah, we will revisit that conversation. AAG also has a new executive director in the last few years, and it's a conversation we need to return to after. I guess it was a decade ago when that was.
It was a decade ago, yes. Yeah, well, the
last
change
talked
leadership hopefully will bring new ideas.
Yeah. We've got a specific question that's come up here, wondering if the Endless Frontier Act provides an opportunity for the GI science community to get a different seat at the table with NSF.
That's hard to say. The Endless Frontier Act has become rather a big political Christmas tree. So it is going to be pretty brutal in the reconciliation process. I would suggest UCGIS community work with the House Science Committee if they have things that they would like to see put forward as part of that effort. But right now, to my understanding, there's no real money behind that bill. Right now, it's kind of an unfunded mandate. If you talk to the appropriators, they don't really know where the money's going to come from yet. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't necessarily spend a lot of cycles on that front. There may be other opportunities that you could fly under the radar and get a lot done. I think I've been successful because I flew under the radar. I was working on things before people started paying attention to them. Mm-hmm. Slip them in.
All right. Well, Lea, Dr. Shanley, thank you so much again for your thoughts, for your observations, for reminding us about all of the efforts and ideas that it takes to get some of the GIS science policy outcomes to fruition. And I thank you so much for your time. There's one more comment I want to mention. Yeah, Rebecca Theobald did put the geocivics redistricting is something with,
Yes.
Obviously, which has
Yes.
major policy and
Huge
geo
policy.
connections right now. So Rebecca Theobald's geocivics project has a booth. Go check it out. It's in our expo, geocivics at uccs.edu. It's the University of Colorado Springs project that she's part of.
Excellent. That is fantastic.
All right, everyone. Thank you for your time. We're going to sign off. The next session at our symposium begins at the bottom of the hour, 12:30 here on the East Coast, when we start with lightning talks. So I think I got that time right. Take care, everyone. Thanks for being here as part of this. And thank you again, Dr. Shanley.
Thank you.